Integrated Pest Management. All right, everybody, welcome back to Archie's Acres and the VSAT program. Today we're going to be talking about IPM, Integrated Pest Management. A few notes before we dive into this lecture. Integrated Pest Management isn't pest management practices that happens upon sign of pest problem. It happens, we integrate integrated pest management prior to even establishing our crop and to get into production. Furthermore, IPM, what's going to work for you in your particular area is going to change drastically from what happens here in San Diego to where you're at in Boston, wherever the case may be. Even difference between where we're at in San Diego compared to where somebody else is in that San Diego based on microclimates and so forth. So some of the best resources to help you establish integrated pest management system is local county ag extensions, as well as reaching out to the land grant university. If you don't know what land grant university is, it's where the USDA actually funds state universities to have agricultural extension offices, as well as other outreach programs to assist farmers. So there's some of the best resources for pest management info. Moving on, one thing to note is that IPM is truly a sign of the overall ecology on the farm. Everything is part of an ecosystem. So if we have an outbreak somewhere, it's due to a lack, for instance, if we have an outbreak of pests, it's due to lack of predator of those pests. So we need to understand, why is there a lack of predator of the pest? Why is this pest outbreak so prevalent now? And so forth. It doesn't happen within a vacuum. And synthetic chemicals are becoming more and more of an issue. Obviously, if you're certified organic, it's not that there isn't organically approved pesticides in the market, but they're not synthetically derived pesticides. And some of the problems with synthetic pesticides is that they tend to be non-discriminate. So not only do they wipe out the targeted pests, but they wipe out a lot of the good guys that help us do our job for free as well, such as lacewings, ladybugs, and so forth. But also a very small fraction of those pesticides actually reaches target, and a lot of it's carried on to food and we ingest it, and a lot of people believe that that causes health issues. Some of those pesticides end up in our ground and our groundwater and get contaminated and so forth, and those are continuing to be concerns amongst consumers as of recently. And so overall, the entire design of your farm needs to be a consideration of integrated pest management, using things like hedgerows and understanding which way the wind blows and how that may affect pest problems. What I mean by pest, it's not only aphids and small insects, for example, but it's also rats and mice. It's also worms and diseases as well. So we want to talk about all those and think about all those when we're talking about IPM. One thing we want to talk about is IPM doesn't focus on pure elimination, especially what we call biointensive IPM. We'll talk about that more in a second. But it doesn't really focus on pure elimination, but a balance that's in our favor. So and one thing to note is, if we're using, let's say, ladybugs to help control our pests, if the ladybugs are 100% efficient and they wipe out the pest, well, what does that mean? They just wiped out their food source as well. So what's then going to happen to those ladybugs? Well, they're going to starve due to lack of food source. So we actually don't want to strive for 100% control, and particularly on the organic side, that's probably not even reasonable. We want to strive for a balance that's within our favor. And so with that said, the presence of a pest doesn't always represent a problem, but it's the presence and the numbers, the quantity of pests, and how much of an effect it's having on a crop, which then poses a problem. We want to consider all our options when dealing with a pest prior to actual implementation of those management practices to deal with the pest, to make sure, one, it actually is effective. Two, it's the best bang for our buck, and we're not spending money that we don't have. And these practices should not conflict with each other. For instance, we should not be
using a pesticide that is detrimental to ladybugs that we paid and released in a greenhouse, right? Those two practices may conflict dealing with a pesticide, considering the pesticide that we may be dealing with. And that means we're either wasting money on the ladybugs or the pesticide. So we want to make sure we're not using, management practices that conflict from each other. When we see a pest, we want to ask the following. Why is the pest there? How did it arrive? And the reason why that's important is because some pests use other insects as a mode of travel. And sometimes we find pests and diseases if we bring stock in from another farm. And if we can trace back to the fact that the pest is prevalent in my crop now because it came from another farm, then we want to think about, well, do we want to do business with that farm in the future? And sometimes we may not have a choice. And if so, what can we do to ensure that when we bring this farmer's stock or seed on the property, that we can manage that so it doesn't cause an outbreak? Use treatment practices or whatever the case may be. And ultimately, why doesn't the parasite and predator complex control the pest? Is there a lack of predator animals and insects to control the pest? If so, why? Lack of habitat is often the key. Can we fix that problem, or is that something that's just going to be a continuing thing to deal with, and so forth? And now looking at the graph in the middle of the screen here, on the left-hand side we have what we call bio-intensive integrated pest management, and then the right-hand side you see conventional integrated pest management. And it kind of shows the difference in practices between the two, as well as where they share similarities. You see one advantage they have on the conventional integrated pest management, that if the problem gets to a point, they have the ability to reach out for chemical control. If you're on a bio-intensive IPM side, in particular if you're organic, that chemical control is probably not an option, all right? And hence, the idea that we want to ensure that we don't get to that problem, so we don't run out of options. So some of the issues that we've had with using pesticides as our first resort to an issue is that pests evolve extremely fast. And we found that, not me, but we as in modern day farmers have found that using pests on a broad scale means that these pests are becoming more and more resistant to these chemicals, and then it becomes even harder to treat the problem, and then we have to continue developing more chemicals to try to treat the problem. It's great for those companies that are in that business, but it sucks for the farmer because it makes them more and more reliant. And ultimately we want to try to, us as farmers, we want to cut our costs so we can be more profitable. So we want to move away from our dependency on chemical control as much as possible. Pesticides are often non-discriminate. We talked about that briefly already. Secondary pests. A lot of times when we use chemical controls as a pest treatment problem, not only do we wipe out the targeted pests, we wipe out all the predators. Again, and a lot of times these chemicals are non-discriminate, and a lot of times it leaves a clean slate. Well, that clean slate is going to be occupied by something. Think about it in terms of a vacuum. If you try to create a vacuum within our atmosphere, unless you have a chamber, that space within that vacuum would be filled with something. In terms of a crop, if you create a clean, sanitized environment, that environment will be occupied by some type of organism. And if we killed all our predator insects, then it's going to make it even easier for a secondary pest to occupy that space, which then means we go back to the chemical control to treat that problem, and it creates this reliance on using chemical control to stay ahead of the issue. And just this picture here is just to show how chemically hazardous some of these chemicals may be. You see this gentleman here wearing the respirator, gloves, full suit. He's mandated by law to use this, so I don't really know what he's spraying, but it is true that some of these chemicals can have adverse health effects when exposed in high dosage. Now, does that mean that the consumer eating food that was treated with this chemical Are they going to be affected? I can't say they will, and I have no evidence to support that. But a lot of consumers are becoming more and more concerned with that fact. So moving on, biointensive integrated pest management the goal is to increase efficiency, all right, by reducing our chemical inputs, for one, reducing the environmental impact, and be more effective and sustainable within our pest management, all right? So sustainability doesn't necessarily just mean that, we're using less of one thing, but it also, sustainability is inherently tied to profitability. And if we're not profitable, and if we're not becoming more profitable, by definition, we're less sustainable as an operation. So part of sustainability, not only with IPM, but as a farm and sustainability as a whole, is trying to cut our costs to the point that makes us more profitable and more sustainable as a business. So in terms of more sustainable as biointensive IPM, building a system that becomes less reliant over time on purchasing inputs to help us control pest problems. And that's one of the focuses of biointensive IPM. We want to try not only at the beginning, certainly not at the middle or the end of our cropping season. We want to start establishing our IPM prior to even establishing our crop. Shared components of biointensive IPM with conventional integrated pest management, monitoring practices, economic trigger lines. And what we mean by that, again, we know through creating a balance that there's going to be some pests that we deal with, and we want to keep that on a very small scale. But knowing if those pests are becoming more prevalent, having a trigger line that says, okay, X amount of percent of my crop is being affected, which means I cannot retail X, whatever that percentage is. And when I get to that point, it means I have to move to the next step within my integrated pest management to try to control this pest problem. Record keeping. Record keeping is key because a lot of pest problems you're going to find are relevant to changes in weather patterns and time of year and so forth. So if you keep records of that, you can start putting in management practices ahead of when that time of the year or during those weather patterns where the pest becomes more prevalent. And that ultimately goes to being more proactive and being a proactive planner. Different types of planning consideration. Design changes of your system layout. And we mean by your system layout, it's not just a hydroponic system here or field grown crops over there. It's the farm as a whole and establishing beneficial habitats. We'll talk more about that in a second. Doing crop rotations depending on the type of agriculture you're doing, the type of farming you're doing. Choosing pest resistant varieties. And there's not a whole lot of those on the on the pest insect side of stock that's resistant, but there are several, in fact very common, even on the organic side, to find disease resistant seed and stock, and we should be looking for those at every opportunity that we can get. As you go into the heirloom side of your seed or stock, you're going to find that they become more and more susceptible to pest problems, and that's one of the reasons why they tend to have higher value in the marketplace, because growers have to deal with those pest problems. Technical information. Again, we talked about where to find a lot of that technical information from the land-grant universities and from the local agricultural extension offices. Here in California, land-grant universities, we actually have two, UC Davis and UC Riverside, and we have several UC, in fact we have a UC prevalence, I believe, in every county. This is just a picture of an ladybug chowing down on some type of aphid or something like that. It's important to know, we'll talk more about life cycles of not only our pests but our beneficial insects here in a few minutes, but the ladybug is actually more productive as a larvae when it's within its larvae stage than it is as an adult. And that's very common with our predator insects, to include lacewings and a lot of the others. They're more useful as the larvae stage than they are as an adult, and we'll talk more about why here in a few minutes. So we want to understand the biology of the pests and the beneficial organisms which will help us target the pest. And what we mean by the biology is not, we're really referring to the pest and our predators' life cycles, all right? Because what we try to do, particularly on a biointensive IPM, is that all pests, as well as our predators, who the guys we like, have some type of life cycle, have some type of a chain of events that happens within their life. So let's look at ladybugs, for instance. Ladybugs start with their eggs, right? And eggs are actually, let me recolor this, because the eggs are actually orange, and they're typically laid on the bottom side of leaf tissue by the ladybug adults, but they stand straight up, almost like a football that you're getting ready to tee off. So they start with eggs, and when the ladybug hatches out of the eggs, it then goes into its larvae stage. It's drawing generic larvae. And these little tiny larvae actually look like little alligators. And a lot of small insects look the same way. In fact, lacewings and ladybug larvae look fairly similar. As they grow into the larvae stage, at some point, they pupate. All right, so this is larvae. And this is where they pupate, also referred to as cocooning. All right. Once they go through the pupate process, they then form to come out as mature, in this case, ladybugs, where they then go and lay eggs, and the process starts over again. What we want to do with biointensive IPM, if this was a pest, is not necessarily kill this guy over here, kill this. Somewhere we want to interrupt the chain. All right. So if we can interrupt the chain between the larvae and the pupate stage, they can never become adults and lay eggs. All right. Now, an example of this is with our avocado trees. Thrip is a prevalent pest for avocado farmers here in Southern California. And the thrip adults live on the underside of the tissue of the avocado tree. And when the fruit begins to form, the avocado has small flowers. And so the avocado fruit themselves are very small when they first begin to form. At that point, the thrip can basically scar the tissue. Now, the thrip can't do that for how long? It's not very long after the avocado begins to mature more. The thrip can no longer have effect, but the scab it creates grows in proportion to the avocado, and it can make some pretty ugly fruit that consumers don't want to buy. So we have to treat the thrip problem. What we did when we first moved on this property to treat the thrip problem was we used beneficial nematodes. And nematodes are soil-borne predator organisms. So we applied it through our irrigation system into the soils. Now, how can that thrip affect the how can those beneficial nematodes affect the adult thrip on the tissue of the avocados? They can't, but the thrip larvae move into the soil to mature and then come back to the tissue, move up into the tree as adults. So the beneficial nematode helped us kill the larvae, which means that there wasn't adult thrips to move back into the larvae and lay fresh eggs. Hence, we broke this cycle and suppressed the thrip on the avocados. The goal is to maintain and increase biological diversity as a whole. And if you go back to our compost tea lecture, we talk quite a bit about biodiversity, and also refer to our soil, sustainable soil disease management. We talk about why diversity is so crucial on the microbial soil stage, but it's true all the way around. The more diversity we have on a microbiology scale to all the way to aphids and pests that we visually see and deal with, the more diversity, the more competition, the more antagonism, the less ability for a pest problem to become prevalent, and that's what we want. And what we do above ground can directly affect what happens below ground. Again, about 70% of pests and diseases spend at least part of their life cycle in the ground, or if we're in hydroponics using Dutch buckets or something like that, within the media and so forth. And so all that needs to be taken into account. Also, are we using excess nutrients, or are nutrients out of balance? Excess nutrients can attract pests. In fact, they found that excessive nitrogen can attract aphids. Nutrients out of balance may mean that our crop isn't healthy and it lacks natural defense mechanisms, almost like our body does. If we're not eating healthy, we become more susceptible to infections and so forth. Crops are the same way. So 50% of photosynthetic production is sent to the root zone, and out of that 50%, another 50% of that is leaked out into the soil in forms of gas. And this can influence what takes place and what organisms live in the root zone. Again, we want obviously favorable organisms to live in our root zone. And a lot of that has to do with what are we feeding the plant, what does the plant have access to in terms of food source and all that type of stuff. And that can influence what's taking place in our soils. Again, we could dive more into that if you go to the Sustainable Soils lecture, Sustainable Soil Disease Management lecture. Soil with high organic matter equals soil with high biology. And that, again, that means more competition, more antagonism. That'll help us suppress disease pathogens and so forth. Genetic diversity. If you have one crop, monocropping, you grow the same crop year after year after year, you're painting a big target on yourself. So by changing up crops, either crop rotation or using a diverse change in genetics within a particular crop, can help you kind of disguise that target that you're producing. And then incorporating hedgerows, various crop varieties kind of goes to that point as well. Crop rotations, again, you're disguising your target, which is our crop, by changing what we're growing in a particular area, maybe a couple times a year or maybe every couple years. They don't only change what's above ground but also below ground, but it's also important to ensure that we're not rotating our crops with other crops with the same susceptibilities. We want to rotate our crops with crops that don't have the exact same susceptibilities, again, because we want to eliminate the target we're painting on ourselves. Considerations include, and here's the key, when we're trying to disguise our crops, so we want to get away from the monocrop method, try to disguise our crops so we can suppress how many chemical uses or suppress how much money we're spending on IPM. But the bottom line goes, if we're going to rotate it with another crop, what crop can also provide me with a attractive economic return, right? Because we're still going to have bills to pay and all that stuff, so economic return of that crop rotation is key. Do we have the proper equipment and management practices in place to accommodate this other crop we're dealing with, right? If we're growing something like heads of lettuce and we're used to being out there chopping a head of lettuce and throwing it in a box and sending it to market, that's drastically different than doing something like growing peppers or tomatoes. So do we have the equipment? Does the staff know how to manage? And do we know all about the fertility and the IPM practices for those other crops we're planting? That needs to be a consideration when you're thinking about crop rotations. Interplanting, again, another way to disguise a particular crop is by, instead of having a field or a greenhouse, whatever it is, with all of one type of crop, it's every other row in that field or every other bench, where the case may be, has a different crop growing within. Again, the key there is to try to disguise what we're hiding, and you want to use intercrop with other types of varieties that don't have the same susceptibility that its neighbor does. Strip cropping kind of refers to if you have multiple fields that you're growing crops in, have each field growing different crops. Again, continuing to try to disguise that crop, try to increase diversity and so forth. We already talked about ensuring that our seed and stock is sanitized before it comes on the property. We talked about resistant varieties already. Sanitation of the farm. Sanitation from ensuring things like our clippers are being cleaned before they go from one greenhouse to the next greenhouse, so to ensure we're not taking some type of disease or pest from that one greenhouse and affecting another greenhouse. Cleaning surfaces, there's those type of sanitation practices which are key, but also think of sanitation practices in terms of ensuring a wood pile is properly stacked so that it doesn't become a home to rodents, or ensuring that you're burning that brush when it's available to burn, to ensure it doesn't become a home to rodents. So think of that in terms of that type of sanitation as well. Spacing of plants, very common, particularly for greenhouse, hydroponic, and aquaponic growers, to want to try to cram as many plants into a small space as physically possible. The reason why we think this way is more plants in one space means over in terms of a year, there's going to be more revenue generated. The problem with that is one, when we start to contain a plant space to a point, it becomes a product that the consumers don't want to buy because it's tall and lanky and very skinny. And most of our customers want very abundant heads of lettuce or whatever it is. So, but also, it reduces the airflow and the light within our crop, and that increases moisture. And you have tissue that are touching each other, no light within. Tissue growing together creates moisture within that space, and with no light means there's no radiation that's moving in there that can kill off any type of potential disease problems. And a lack of airflow, that creates an environment where diseases can harbor and spread very quickly. So we want to make sure we have adequate plant spacing. And there's a lot of research done on good plant spacing. This type of information isn't hard to find, but we want to cheat it all the time and try to cut that in half, what the case may be. But I advise you against doing so until you have a better idea of exactly what works and what doesn't work by getting your hands on it and playing with it. Altering plant dates, again, just trying to continue to disguise and try to miss, if there is a peak season for a certain pest, to try to miss that peak season if available. And then obviously, if we create an optimum growing environment where our crop is healthy as possible, it's going to have more natural defenses to protect itself as well. All right, mulches. We have both organic mulches and plastic mulches. Now, this is more for orchard and field grower guys. Most orchards are using organic mulches like wood chips and so forth. And a lot of field growers are using plastic mulches. This is where we form our beds. We pull out typically black layer of plastic. And what that does is it helps us retain moisture, restricts weed growth, and can deal with a lot of pest problems too, such as fruit flies and other type of flies, eye gnats, who lay their larvae within that soil. We cover that soil up, it means it's no longer accessible to them. But what they're getting into now also is colored mulches, and they're finding that different colored plastic mulches can potentially deter pests from your crop. We don't know a whole lot about this, and this is research is fairly new, but tomatoes with red mulch is an example of that. You see different color mulches here in a trial plot in the top right hand of your screen. So there's pretty interesting stuff coming out here. Again, this is all new. We don't know a whole lot about it, but maybe worth something to look into, especially if you're a soil field grown guy. Okay, and then GMOs. GMO stands for genetically modified organisms. Most people have probably heard about GMOs through Roundup Ready crops. Roundup is a chemical, it's a herbicide. It's produced by a company, Monsanto. Monsanto also produces GMO stock, for instance, corn and soy and a few others that they call Roundup Ready, meaning you can grow this crop and you can apply this herbicide Roundup and it won't directly affect the crop. It'll have only effect on the weeds. There's a lot of concern from consumers about what the long-term effect of GMOs are going to be. We don't have any statistics that show it's going to be detrimental in any way, but it is a concern of a lot of consumers. In fact, there's more and more proposition being voted on these days to try to ensure that GMOs are being labeled or whatever it is. And there's a lot of people believe that they're having detrimental effects on the environment. There's some farmers out there that says that the Roundup is no longer having effect on some of the weeds it used to. They're creating that the weeds have grown resistant to Roundup, and you have these super weeds. Not only are reliant on spraying Roundup to treat the weeds that had been in the past, but now they have to do hand practices to get these super weeds out, and then so that only raises their expenses, and now they have to pay for both of those management practices. They also have what we call, there's also GMO BT corn. Now BT has been used by organic farmers for a long time. BT is a bacteria, and it affects, I believe, the reproductive system or the digestive system of certain pests. And they've created corn that produces BT naturally. The problem is, again, going back to pests evolving and growing resistance, is when we have acres and acres and acres of corn and we're using BT over and over and over again, at some point, a lot of people believe, and other people believe that this has already happened, these pests grow resistant to BT. Now, organic farmers, like I said, have been using BT for decades, if not centuries, and what organic farmers know is that pests will become resistant, and so many organic farmers will integrate BT as part of this broader IPM. So they're not just relying on BT over and over again. They may use BT one week, next several weeks they're doing other management practices, and they go back to BT, and that time in between ensures that the pest isn't growing resistant to the BT. Biological control, talked about a lot of this already, but that's where we use beneficial organisms from beneficial insects like ladybugs, lacewings, parasitic wasps to help control pests. And it's also where we use other biological controls like funguses and bacteria to help control pests and diseases. And then there's also the incorporation of mammals and birds and so forth, like owls, to help us treat rodent problems and so forth. And so again, we want to make sure that those practices aren't competing with each other. For instance, you may use bumblebees to help pollinate your flowers, while some of these biological sprays that are using like a bacteria or something to help treat pests may also be detrimental to the bumblebees. So you want to make sure those practices are competing with each other. Again, we want to strive for a balance. All of those biological practices, the biology themselves need a habitat to survive and to reproduce. They need a food source if the pest isn't an issue. So what can we do to create that habitat? Well, hedgerows are one of the best ways to do it, as well as beneficial flowers. And in fact, if you look under the USDA has a department that they call the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service. And what these guys do is help landowners try to conserve natural resources. And they have many programs. One of the programs that we've used in the last several years is the EQUIP program. Environmental Quality Incentive Program, I believe is what EQUIP stands for. And what the EQUIP program will do with the NRCS is they'll actually come out to your farm or your property. They'll look around and say, yeah, we can ensure that we can help owls survive here by putting an owl box over here, and we can improve your irrigation by changing it from these type of sprinklers to drip irrigation, for instance. We can ensure you have beneficial insects on your property by putting a hedgerow over here and beneficial flowers over here. You do those practices, you sign a contract with them and do those practices, and the NRCS will cost share on some of those practices that you implemented. So it means that you get some of the money back after you put in these practices that you agreed to, but also we get stronger integrated pest management system in place. So it's a win-win, so check that out when you get your property rolling. And the reason why we talk about beneficial flowers and hedgerows so much is because they create nectar and pollen that could be a food source for our beneficial insects when our target pest is no longer available, if we were 100% effective on killing them off, but also provides them a shelter and some protection from enemies, from their enemies, and a place to survive. This picture here is what we call lacewing. Lacewing is one of the most effective predator you could probably use. You actually call it the aphid lion. It's usually from 1 to 2 centimeters long. You see a long, skinny green body with the long, clear wings. Very difficult to find and monitor is a challenge with these guys, but they're very effective. The most effective point is when they're in the larvae stage as well. So you typically buy these guys as eggs and release them in the larvae is very effective. But one thing to note about the eggs is the eggs can be a food source for ants. So if ants get to the egg, they'll take off with the egg and you'll never get your larvae. So a lot of growers will try to keep the eggs in an area where they can monitor them until the eggs hatch. The challenge with that is if the larvae hatches and there isn't an immediate food source available, they'll cannibalize each other. So if you use that method to release lacewings, ensure you're keeping a close eye on it, and as soon as you see them start hatching from the eggs, you got to get those guys out there so they don't start eating each other. Again, apply biological controls. We're releasing predatory organisms into the environment. One thing to note is temperature and weather patterns. Ladybugs, for instance, if it's too cold, they just go dormant. So it doesn't do us a whole lot of good release ladybugs in the winter when it's nice and cold. So understand that, otherwise we're just dumping money into something that's not going to provide us a return. Some pests like lacewings will have effect on a fairly broad range of pests, while other predator insects we may use for specific treatment needs. For instance, the tomato hornworm, which can devastate tomatoes, you could treat by using a certain parasitic wasp that will lay its eggs in the back of the tomato hornworm, and when the larvae hatch from the eggs, it'll burrow into the tomato hornworm and use it as a food source, killing the tomato hornworm. The wasp doesn't affect a whole lot of other pests. In fact, in the tomatoes, that may be the only reason why you're using that particular wasp. So that wasp is used for a very specific host or very specific pest issue. One unique thing about the greenhouse environment is that it is enclosed. When we release our predator insects, they don't have a whole lot of places they can go, right? So they're kind of confined to our greenhouse. And so you can be 100% effective in a greenhouse using predator pests like ladybugs. But keep in mind, typically in a greenhouse, the rotation of a crop is very fast. And we want to be able to use a pest that has a life cycle that can keep up with that speed. Lacewings, for instance, have a longer lifespan than ladybugs and some of the others. And because it's longer, it doesn't make it the greenhouse doesn't make them a very effective environment for you to use lacewings, because by the time the lacewing adults are laying its egg, you're harvesting that product that the eggs are on. The eggs are being lost or going out the door with your product that you're selling. So we typically want to stick to predators that have a shorter lifespan in a greenhouse environment. Lacewings is one of those. There's parasitic wasps that work very well. The only challenge with them is that they are typically hard to monitor. This is what ladybugs look like when you release them in mass. This is probably like a half gallon, which is about 30,000 ladybugs or so. A couple things about ladybugs: they're cheap, readily available. You can get them at most nurseries and hydroponic stores and so forth. And they're very easy to monitor. Again, they're more effective in the larvae stage. Overall, they're not one of the most effective predators out there, but in a greenhouse environment, if you're proactive and release them, they can do a great job, and they're easy to see and they're fairly cheap. When we release our ladybugs, we want to release them either in early morning or in the evening time when it's cool, because when the temperatures are cool, they're slower to move. And if you release them and they're really excited when they're being released, a lot of times they'll fly straight up into the air, get caught by the headwinds, and be dragged off location. So release them when it's cool. Make sure there's water around. So maybe you just irrigate it or something like that. That'd be great. But they'll be coming out of dormancy, hungry and thirsty. What I mean by dormancy is that typically when you buy them from a supplier, they keep it in a refrigerator. And you can do that when you bring them home. If you bring them home midday, throw your ladybugs in the refrigerator. It's going to slow them down. They'll hibernate until they warm back up again. Upon release, another trick you can do is take a 5-gallon bucket, fill it up with water, and pour a Sprite or a 7-Up in there, stir it around. And then if you have a sack full of ladybugs like this one on your screen, take that whole sack and dip it within that water with the soda in it, and that sugar that was in the soda will make their wings sticky, and so they can't fly for a few hours or a few days. One thing to be cautious of with both going back to our lacewings and the ladybugs, particularly the larvae and the eggs, is ants. They will destroy not only adult lacewings and ladybugs, but definitely the eggs as well as the larvae. And ants also have a symbiotic relationship with aphids. So aphids create a honeydew, what they call honeydew. It's a sticky substance and it's sugary, and the ants like it. So a lot of times when we see an aphid problem, the first thing we look for is there ants around? Because ants, and we see them on our benches within our greenhouse, we'll actually carry them in on their back. So if you see an ant trail leaning up to one of our benches in the greenhouse, you can look on those ants, you can find aphids on their back, and they'll carry them in the crop and they'll strategically place them, and they'll literally farm these aphids, and aphids will create this honeydew substance that the ants like and use as a food source, which means the ants will also protect them from predators. So if you see an aphid outbreak or something like that, if there's ants around, we want to treat the ants before we try to stick our predators on them, because ants will be able to defeat our predators. We like to use diatomaceous earth around here for ants. What diatomaceous earth is, it's a ground up powder. To us it looks like talc powder, but it's ground up, typically bone and shale and so forth. And when ants crawl over diatomaceous earth, it cuts up their exoskeleton and they end up dying off. Different mechanical controls, from heating or steaming a soil, not very common, very expensive equipment, but that's one way to treat soil. To weed cloth to help suppress weeds. Insect netting, so we can completely isolate the inside of a greenhouse by using things like insect netting and a vestibule to protect that front door. We have a clean room before we actually move into the greenhouse. To have, it says vacuums, but it actually should be blowers over greenhouse doors, kind of like when you walk into a cafeteria, you open that door and there's air blowing at you. That keeps flying insects from moving into the greenhouse. You may want to have a sanitation pad for your shoes before walking into your grow or before walking into your greenhouse. I know in this avocado area where root rot is a problem, there's on serious avocado farms, there is basically tire baths before you drive onto an avocado farm. Your tires are getting sanitized to ensure that you're not tracking avocado root in on your vehicle's tires. Pest identification is the most important step of IPM, and the reason why is if we misidentify the pests we're trying to treat and then we spend money on treatment options, they're not going to be effective, and then we're out that money and the pest continues to grow, survive, and colonize our crops. So we want to be sure that we have positive ID of our pests so we can identify the most effective and most economically feasible treatment problems. And then once we have identified the pests, what plants are not being hosted, these are some of the questions we want to ask ourselves. What plants are not being hosted, and is there a reason why? What is the source? Are these pests there because of an eggs, or is there inoculants? Is it the ants that are bringing them in? Is there some type of relationship like that? Where and how does the pest overwinter? And can a change in the system, again, a system is in our management systems or in the system as a farm as a whole, can we change something within that system that will have a positive effect on that pest population? Okay, monitoring, different methods for monitoring. Sticky traps. Sticky traps are really available at most nurseries, and they're usually these bright yellow or blue cards that you can hang and have a sticky substance on them, so when insects fly into them, they get stuck. They're not really designed for pest control. They're designed to help us look at those cards, see what flies in there, and it gives us an idea of what's surviving within the canopy or a crop. Again, understanding if there's seasonal changes for pest problems and pest populations. You can shake a plant over a white paper plate, see it falls into that paper plate. That might help you identify pests. Magnifying glass should be a tool that you have accessibly available. Soil testing, deformity in tissue. A lot of times we look at deformed tissue and we might think it's a genetic issue or it's a nutrient deficiency or something like that, but you'd be surprised what pests that are so small that our eyes can't see it and how they can actually deform our tissue. And some insects will actually live underneath that top layer of the tissue as well. And that can cause deformity in the tissue. And then residues on the leaf tissue or underneath the leaf tissue. Again, that honeydew from the aphids and the ants will leave a glossy, clear substance that's shiny, and you can spot it from a little ways away when a plant's infected with it. And what will also happen is after aphids die off naturally, their bodies will get stuck in that honeydew substance. It'll rot, and you'll get this mold-like look in that sticky honeydew as well. All right, record keeping. We should be keeping track of our irrigation practices, see if that has any effect on either pest problems, pest solutions, cultivation, the nutrition of our crop and overall fertilization practices, and then weather. And again, if we can track pest problems, like this little graph you have in the middle of your screen here, maybe we can identify certain times of the year where pests are more prevalent and certain types of pests are more prevalent. And before we get to that type of year, maybe we could put management practices in place to ensure that that spike and issues with that pest is somewhat mitigated. Other chemical controls, even on the organic side, biorational pesticides like BT and spinosad. Again, that term bio refers to biologically active. BT and spinosad, these are both bacterial-based sprays that affects either the digestive system or the reproductive system of a pest. A lot of these sprays and stuff on the organic side that we use, because they don't have effect on target, it does affect a digestive issue or it does affect a reproductive system, means it could take several days for them to actually show effect and signs of working. Particle film barriers is basically a clay that is put over an apple, typically in apples, but it may be used for other scenarios. But it just creates a barrier that the pest can't penetrate and protects the fruit that way. Sugar esters, never used it before. This comes from a tobacco plant. The tobacco produces these as a natural defense, but it acts very similar to insecticidal soaps. Botanical pesticides such as pyrethrum and neem. Neem oil comes from the neem tree. There's an active ingredient within the neem oil that is a natural insecticide. Pyrethrum comes from the chrysanthemum flower. There's only one, and maybe a few others, pyrethrum products out there actually certified organic, and that's because a lot of the practices used to extract the pyrethrum from the chrysanthemum flower aren't necessarily organic in nature. But pyrethrum is a great product. The challenge with it is not only does it tend to be costly, but it is non-discriminate as well. So it can have a negative effect on our predator insects that we're spending money on. And then compost teas, again, the goal of compost tea is increased diversity. And the more diversity, the more challenging it is for a pest outbreak. Weed management. Weeds oftentimes can host both pests and diseases. So we want to suppress weeds. And not to mention that weeds extract water and nutrients from either our soil or media or whatever that we're growing in, and can create competition for light as well for our crop. So we want to suppress weeds as much as possible. One thing weeds do for us is if we, mechanically, using weed whackers or whatever, hack these down, is allow us to add organic matter to our soils. But if in some cases weeds can go to seed, if we allow it to happen, sometimes that means that the weed can continue to sprout for the next 7 years, which can be an issue. So we want to get to the weeds before they flower and go to seed. Different types of ways to prevent a weed going to seed is to, weed cloth and so forth. Crop rotations can help suppress weeds. Ensuring that if we're using compost or manures, that we've fully composted both the compost pile or manure pile to ensure that the pile heated up to a degree that killed off any seed from weeds that may be present within that pile. Ensuring that we have good quality topsoil. They found that the healthier the soil with organic matter, the more weed suppression happens organically and naturally. Other ways to ensure that a positive biointensive IPM, offer consumers more variety. Instead of that monocropping mentality and trying to live within a monocrop, offer your consumers several different crops that you're rotating within out of the year. Again, that crop rotation can help be a positive part of our IPM. Again, utilizing government programs like the NRCS, like the land-grant universities and so forth, can be not only a huge benefit, but a lot of times those resources are free. Those are taxpayer funded for you to take advantage of. So in summary, we're looking for a balance, not 100% control of pest and disease issues, but we want to establish those trigger lines to let us know when we need to be moving to the next step within our integrated pest management practices. We want to be proactive. We don't want to wait for an infestation, particularly on the organic side. If you had an infestation, there's not a whole lot you can do because most organic controls won't treat infestations. They'll help us suppress, not necessarily treat. Think about long-term planting. Those are hedgerows and beneficial flowers and stuff like that. They're not going to just pop up. They take time, and they take time to establish once you get them in the ground or whatever the case may be. And with that, understanding the habitat to encourage beneficial insects, beneficial organisms, not only from mycorrhizas in the soils, but to bird and bat boxes that can help us treat rodents and problems like that. And then never stop learning, because IPM and pest problems will continue to evolve, and your IPM plan on your farm needs to evolve with it. That does it for integrated pest management. We'll see you next time.